Welcome to Pratidhwani, where we try to humanize science. I'm your host, G.V. Pawan Kumar. It is my absolute delight and pleasure to introduce you to the guest on today's episode, the one and the only Pushkar Sohoni. Pushkar is an architectural and cultural historian who has very interesting and very diverse kind of viewpoints with respect to how history has been actually, captured and also made into forms which are accessible to the people. He's a scholar, and at the same time his work has been extremely accessible to a lot of people who are interested in history, historiography, and also various interesting aspects of architectural and art history. Pushkar is a professor at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, Pune, and he heads the Humanities and Social Sciences Department. With this very short introduction, I welcome Pushkar on Pratidhwani.
Thank you.
Pushkar, ever since I have had various interactions with you on, of course, various committees and other places, I've been fascinated with the fact that you had a background which was in science, which was in architecture, and then you kind of very nicely branched into art and archaeological and architectural history. Tell us about how did that happen right from the origins.
Well, talking to a physicist, I must say there was no Newton moment. There was no apple that fell on my head and it made me reconsider everything. I think it happened over a long period of time where already I think opting for architecture as an education basically buys you 5 years of time to decide what you want to do in life. It might not be designing buildings, but it's thinking about the world broadly. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the 5 years of architectural education, I was fairly sure I wanted to do something connected with history. And of course, given the training I had at that point, it only made sense to enroll in a program that was going to be about conserving historic buildings. And so I got into a master's degree for historic preservation and realized that I was not empowered to make decisions about historic buildings unless I understood the context of their production itself. And so a lot of energy was spent over the next decade thinking about how people have built in the past, how people have thought about buildings, what kind of knowledge is embodied in architectural creation. Is it just whims and fancies that make people build in certain ways, or does architecture really convey deeper facts about societies in the past? And so eventually I ended up getting a doctorate in the history of art, but specifically in the history of architecture. And of course, since I took a long time doing that, I also did other things like go on archaeological expeditions to Bronze Age sites.
To Iran.
Took a number of breaks doing things which might not be of direct use, but then they broadly inform the way one thinks about the world.
One of the fascinating aspects, having also kind of looked at your work and tried to understand your viewpoint, you have this element of looking at the same thing from slightly different perspective. In fact, that is probably something you have also written about. And one of the aspects also emphasized in your work is the ability to preserve information. Because you have also done something related to bibliographies and libraries, where you played a critical role when you were in Pennsylvania, where we're going to come to that part of it. But that is actually such an important point of view, which is somehow lacking in our kind of intellectual culture, right? At least in India. Do you think that was a concerted effort, or you kind of stumbled upon that viewpoint?
I think sooner or later everybody comes around to the point of view that all the knowledge that we generate, I mean, after all, as researchers, as scientists, we are all creating new knowledge. And preserving this knowledge is very important. And the best way to preserve it, apart from, of course, having things like, digital repositories and printed stacks of books, is having enough people who can partake of that knowledge. And having societies that engage with knowledge is the only way of keeping it alive. And so humans are absolutely essential to any kind of knowledge preservation. It's not about locking it up in books or digital form. It's actually having enough people who can grasp that knowledge and propagate it in some way. And again, I think sooner or later everybody comes across this thought, because you realize that things that you discover should not be forgotten. Things that you have come to the realization should be shared. I mean, I think this podcast is very much part of that.
Absolutely.
Is making sure that knowledge is somehow disseminated amongst the greatest volume of people.
Yes.
I think viruses pretty much operate the same way.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely. That's a great analogy. In fact, that is one of the very perfect analogies of way you want to percolate information in a society, for example. I would also want to come on the point and kind of discuss a little bit more on your process of writing, which is also something I should emphasize, that Pushkar has actually written very interesting books, and that is something also very fascinating, to put together some viewpoints again from an architecture and historical kind of amalgamation onto one particular platform is quite fascinating. But before we come to all those particular processes and your way of thinking, I would want to touch upon a little bit about your kind of education. Where were you born, and what kind of education you obtained, and other things?
So I think most things about me till the age of 23 happened within a distance of about 10 kilometers from where we are sitting right now.
And we are sitting at Aysar, Pune. So it's in Pune. Yeah, that's true.
And so I grew up in Pune. I attended a school which is a couple of kilometers away. In fact, I've had a long association with this area. And it was, looking back at it, it was a remarkable childhood. But then there was nothing remarkable. It's how everything around the world seemed to be. We were never far away from nature. We were urban, but yet you lived amongst hills. You went away on weekends, on camping trips. Perhaps parents didn't care as much, or it was much safer. And so you could get away with a lot more than I see children doing now. And we were also never told that we have to study a certain thing or pick a certain career path. I remember my grandfather once telling me, whatever you do, there is always room at the top. Which reminds me of Gopal Krishna Gokhale, at least apocryphally, something that's attributed to him, which is, he said, if you want to be a donkey, be a perfect donkey. And so, again, looking back, it was quite a nice childhood, but one just assumed that the whole world was like that. I attended architecture school after that, again, not too far away from where I grew up. It's only at the age of 23 when I left for the United States to attend the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia that I came across a world that was completely different. And it took some adjusting, but I think I adjusted well enough to live there for 17 years, except for occasional breaks like a 1-year postdoctoral fellowship in British Columbia, and little breaks to do field work in Iran, in North India, in a variety of places. But again, very serendipitously, I ended up applying for a job at Aysar, Pune, and came back. If you had asked me the year before that if I had any plans to move to India, I did not. And when people ask me why I moved back, I don't think there Again, any quick and simple answers, things sometimes happen and you embrace it.
This is a kind of a question I keep asking to my guests, because most of the people whom I generally converse with would have had their part of their education or training which is not in India. And even then, there is a concerted effort for them to come back. But as you are mentioning, there is no specific reason why you thought so. Yeah.
Just stop.
Yeah. So in that way, what was the general reason? Did you think a little bit more about that?
No, I think a lot of the research that I do is actually grounded here. And so, on the one hand, I have access to much better facilities, much better archives, much better libraries in the United States. But again, as an art historian, my primary emphasis is not on texts. It is on materials. And so, the field that I study is all here. And so, if you look at my primary archive, it's the site, it's the archaeological site, it's the historic site. And that is much better offered to me as I sit here. And of course, one has to do with lesser library resources, but there are ways to work around
that. That's actually something I'm going to come to, because I know that you not only have been a researcher actively involved with sources, but you also have taken initiatives to create those sources in part as kind of initiative in Pennsylvania libraries, where you've spent quite a bit of time and also initiated some important things. So during this process of your upbringing in Pune, you also would have had a very strong training in engineering, I assume, because you did B.Arch, if I'm correct. And what was that process, Pushkar? Because until then your training is mainly in sciences, I assume. So what was it?
Though with architecture, engineering was one of the typically, 12 to 16 subjects one studied in a semester. And the engineering we learned was really statics and materials. It was never any kind of dynamics. It was never fluid mechanics. So civil engineers are much better equipped to deal with all kinds of things. We dealt with parts of civil engineering. Again, not so much to be civil engineers, but to make sure we understood what civil engineers could or could not do. But the rest of the curriculum was really very open-ended. You were learning everything from human psychology to history to, you had to have your engagement with literature even if it wasn't taught in a classroom. And you were taught to observe the world around you at large. So, why people behave the way they do, why people choose certain kinds of spaces, colors, volumes. It's really a kind of synthesis of trying to understand human behavior, both on scientific and unscientific principles. A lot of what happens in the world is not rational, and trying to rationalize the irrational is part of what architectural training teaches you to do.
Wonderful. That's actually a very fascinating answer, because there is an element of design, and design is as much as an art, as much as science, where there is some kind of a subjectivity which goes along with objectivity, and architecture is one of the great examples. This is also true even in cases where you are involved in some very complex kind of processes within scientific endeavors, where you're building an instrument, ergonomics, and other kind of things too. One of the crucial elements of getting such kind of a multifaceted training is that you would also actually be at the forefront of a paradox of choice, right? How do you go about making a choice of really getting into a stream? And that is one part of the question. The second part is, the transition of going from design architecture to history is also a very, very interesting transition. I would want to kind of touch upon these two things. First is making the choice. Second is specifically choosing history.
I think just last month there was a famous philosopher who said there is no such thing as free will.
Yes.
I mean, I would like to think we do make choices, but I don't think they are so articulated in your mind at that point. There are lots of soft things that affect your decision. Maybe you can voice one or two of them, but I think it's really a sum total of many things that are happening at that given point. And just like people say with hindsight, I wish I had never done that. I don't think anybody acts in one's worst interests. We all assume we are doing it for the best. And I think sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. And so, again, I don't know how much of these are deliberate, conscious choices, or these are just choices that, again, happen. I think I'm a big believer in sometimes just going with a certain kind of flow. And again, talking of subjective and objective, maybe it's a bit provocative, but how much of science is objective anyway is another question that we can't answer.
Absolutely. In fact, it's an important thing. See, the initiative of Pratidhwani is to also bring out the element of subjectivity in the so-called objective pursuit of science, because the science per se is kind of looked as a kind of a framework, and where you are reasonably rigid in what you do, but where you do, how you do, all those things play a critical role.
No, I think we have all kinds of institutions that we have decided by consensus, which will give us the truth. So, for example, a court of law is something which, as society, we have decided by consensus that what a court of law says will be approximately the truth.
Yes.
There might be room for correction, there might be room for refinement, but it is the truth. Before you had these kinds of constitutional courts, maybe 2000 years ago, religious authorities had the same kind of, again by popular consensus, the ability to make what was to be accepted as the truth. And I think since the 17th century or so, scientific academies have been invested with the same kind of power of popular consensus, by which what they agree upon has to be acceptable as the truth. And we've seen that sometimes truths can be completely overturned, and it happens time and again. So again, I mean, is our pursuit of truth, is our pursuit of objective truth really, possible or not? Is something we can think about.
It's a very fascinating and philosophical question. Even within the framework of science, if you look at it, when one is doing science, it is kind of an orientation towards a perceived truth. As you mentioned, there is always a revision. There is always sometimes even overturning of that particular prospect.
And I think the possibility of revision itself is what people have been defining. The whole business of falsifiability, as defined by Popper, becomes the basis of what scientific knowledge is. So if something can be falsified, only then can be accepted as the prevalent truth. But the possibility of falsifying it should exist. If it doesn't exist, it is knowledge that's outside the purview of science. It's some other kind of knowledge. So again, I mean, people always ask, whether science can believe in God, whether God exists. And it's not something that's verifiable nor falsifiable. And therefore, it's a domain of knowledge that is completely outside. I think this is the kind of point of view that Stephen Jay Gould had for years, where he said they are non-overlapping magisteria. Let us not confuse different domains of knowledge. Whereas people like Richard Dawkins have been a lot more militant in saying everything should be explained by science, which is no different from a dogmatic view of spiritual leaders who might say everything will be explained only through spirituality. I think we should be comfortable in having a plurality of domains and let different domains deal with different
But do you think also the fact that, for example, to just kind of give a viewpoint, Dawkins has probably watered down his version a little bit. Because I think his consensus, what he's trying to build, is through an evolutionary biology viewpoint. And to a large extent...
Which is what Stephen Jay Gould also was.
Yeah, precisely right. Why I say this is because in the context of, let's say, even Indian philosophy, the Adhyatma, which is usually considered as the pursuit of, to try to pursue some knowledge in a slightly broader context, either through experimentation or through the thought itself, is something which is which has a slightly different route when you consider, let's say, a conventional viewpoint of let's say church and the state kind of a viewpoint which is there in the West.
I think the distinction always has to be made between the experimental and the experiential.
Yeah.
Where knowledge that is experienced cannot be conveyed outside the human body. It requires one person experiencing something that another has, and they need to have some kind of connect. We are really talking of experimentation where even if you note down the details of your experiment and the controlled conditions, anybody separated not just by distance but also by time, 100 years later, should be able to reproduce the same results. And science fundamentally begins
exactly.
with those kinds of definitions. Later on, it of course moves to other definitions of falsifiability and so on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But experiential knowledge doesn't require any recording outside the human body of any protocol. It can be transmitted internally. We also have this in, to draw a parallel, in historic buildings, what you see is very often you have names of people who design buildings, who commission buildings, who pay for buildings. You might have the engineer's name. You never have the names of all the people who've labored. People who've cut the stone, people who've laid the mortar, people who've dug the ground for foundations and so on. And the people who design the building and construct it top down, their names are always recorded because their knowledge fundamentally is knowledge that can travel. It's knowledge that can be recorded outside the human body. So you can have a plan brought in from Ottoman Turkey and realized in India. But the people who actually build with their hands, they don't have this mobility. And the only way they pass on their knowledge is actually what we might call by gesture. So, somebody will be apprenticed for 10, 12 years, hold a chisel and a hammer and cut stone a certain way. There are no manuals of doing this. And even if there are, the manual will never teach you. And so, we've decided to privilege one kind of knowledge over another kind of knowledge. And again, in the sciences, we valorize one kind of knowledge over another kind of knowledge, which is not to say that, the other kind of knowledge is lesser. But again, within a scientific discourse, it should have no room. It has a different domain. It should exist there.
Beautifully put. In fact, this point of view of, looking at knowledge from bottom up and top down is something which is very important. There has been also some philosophers who have thought about this, even contemporary ones. Mm-hmm. There is a very nice book where the title of the book, probably if I'm correct, is Shop Class as Soul Craft. It's a very interesting and deep kind of exploration of a person who actually works for the US government for a long time. Is essentially doing something which is very kind of intensive in terms of computational work and things like that. But he leaves the job and takes up motorcycle repair. And he's written a book about that. It's a very fascinating. It's Matthew Crawford is the author of that book, and he makes a very similar point because even if you look at our PhD interviews, for example, in sciences, most of the time we are essentially asking questions which are in the domain of the experimental or to a large extent theoretical, which has been actually thought outside the thing. But there are also a lot of tricks of the trade, so to speak. We call that in our laboratories, where you can't just write it down, but you actually pass it from one generation of the students to another generation.
And I think Bruno Latour wrote a lot about this with his study of lab cultures, saying, of course, I mean, even within this objective, outside the body knowledge of science, there are lots of practices which can only be passed on inherently from person to person. There will be bits and pieces of lab protocol that are never recorded because it's assumed everybody knows it.
Absolutely.
And I think the big debate over, Latour brings me to this, where I think there is a camp of very, let's say, militant scientists who want to prove that everything in the world can be brought within the world of rational science, where every action can be described either mechanically or chemically or electrically.
Yeah.
And so everything in a sense is predetermined, all our actions, which of course leaves no room for free will. But that's another problem. But everything, including our appreciation of art, can be explained purely within the scientific realm. It's just that we haven't discovered what our irrational choices are. We have to figure out mechanisms by which to bring them into science. Now, on the other hand, there is a group of sociologists, starting all the way with people like Auguste Comte, who think that all scientific endeavor is basically a sociological behavior, and therefore we can explain all of science within a social sciences framework.
Human context.
And so you have one group of scientists which is trying to understand arts as can be explained scientifically, and you have a group of social scientists who's trying to understand science as human behavior. And I think when C.P. Snow wrote of the clash of two cultures, I think, since then it's evolved a lot, where both the camps are trying to cast their net so wide that it brings the other within.
It's a beautiful kind of, exposition on that. One aspect which is very crucial, as you correctly mentioned, is that is to also look at things from a viewpoint which need not be all inclusive of your own kind of thoughts, and maybe also abilities and capabilities. For a lot of knowledge within India, for example, has not been registered or recorded, whereas, as you correctly mentioned, there are so many Indian architectures which have been built bottom up by people who are probably outstanding artisans, but they did not have kind of the practice of putting it onto let's say some documentation and other things, which is a shame. But also it makes us wonder how different human beings are, right? Because generally the notion of education and exposition, scholarship has been brought only from one viewpoint. There might be some other viewpoints too which are necessary. What is your thought basically on trying to understand this kind of plurality of knowledge?
I think various kinds of knowledge systems have their own validity within their own context and domain. You can't apply everything everywhere.
Yeah.
And this is one of the big causes of friction, where people try to fit one kind of knowledge within a very different context. So if you are going to do experimental science in a lab, do not bring notions of meditation in there. It might not work, and you'll have a hard time explaining everything. Yet on the other hand, we do know with subatomic physics, notions of
space and time actually get
intention are so embroiled within measurements. So always leave room open for new ways of understanding things, but do not try to force your own domain into another one. I think we have to admit the fact that the kind of broad academic ecosystems in which we operate are primarily drawn from Europe, and they've been so in India for about 150, 200 years. And there is no going away from it, and there is no going back to something else. We have to, instead of thinking of European history as alien, we now have to embrace it as much as our own. I think every time you have new ideas, you have fertilization from somewhere else, instead of saying it's alien, what you do is you also embrace that and make yourself even more plural. And so I think we have to embrace, we can't wish away right away 200-300 years, 700-800 years, 1500, 2000 years. So for example, there are Mesopotamian inputs in Indian astronomy, which, you can't wish away. The Greco-Roman system of days of the week is something that gets introduced to India. And again, there is no wishing it away. It's as much ingrained in us. There are all kinds of innovations that come in from various places around the world. And instead of really shunning that, embrace it and realize what a rich background you have, tapping almost every continent for some form of knowledge. And I think, the 200 years of colonial rule also has to be embraced with the same idea. Because the minute we embrace it, we are also people who get the legacy of Galileo, of the Renaissance, of the Islamic Renaissance in Baghdad. All this becomes ours.
It's a very nice viewpoint. Also, it is a very, an open and also inclusive way of looking at things. For that matter, it truly has implication in understanding, let's say, structure of scientific revolutions also. Because if you look at the way a lot of technologies have evolved, including industrial revolution, mainly, for example, propelled by engines. If you look at Newcomen, James Watt, Sadi Carnot, these are all people in some way or the other were connected to some kind of colonial and imperial kind of powers, which means that there was exchange of ideas, and not only from there to here, but from all directions. And for that matter, a lot of experiments what Newton did at some point of time had a lot of support from various colonies which Britain was interacting with. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Again, this has been well documented that big strides happen in Europe in the Enlightenment, because as the European colonial contact with the world increases, they come back with things from new lands, things that they've never encountered before. And their science has to be flexible and agile enough to explain things that they're seeing which they've never seen.
Yes.
And so medicine is a great example.
Absolutely.
Where tropical diseases of all kinds, the natural sciences in general, natural philosophy, which is biology, physics, all of it. Then you have natural history, which is geology. And again, some part of biology, is all informed by completely new things that European colonialists encounter everywhere else. And so, of course, it is a two-way street. They go out, they come across things they can't explain. They have to come up with new theories and new experiments. They're also picking up on indigenous systems of knowledge, particularly in medicine. Sometimes even mechanical devices, sometimes technologies are borrowed. But then they're put through a process of refinement and further experimentation and theorization, something that Francis Bacon always talked of.
Yes.
And once it goes through that cycle, it's then projected to the world as a European technology, a European discovery. But sure enough, there are inputs from everywhere in the world.
Absolutely. In fact, that has been repeatedly observed even with a lot of evidences that that has been the case. The framework of also looking at history as only a domain of a particular part of the geography is also a flaw, right? As you correctly mentioned, if you consider science as a human endeavor, you actually can cast your net as wide as possible and other things. So this kind of viewpoint of having a very strong footing in architecture and then moving towards history, how did that transition happen, and what was the process, Pushkar? How did you do that?
Sorry. So, all knowledge creation is essentially dependent on history because we rely on past knowledge.
Absolutely correct.
And history, as opposed to what people might imagine as the narrative of important people or important events, is actually the narrative of the everyday. In fact, in the past 50 years, most historians have had debates by which history has been rescued from high events, high people and high points, somewhere to the subaltern,
yes,
where we want to write histories that talk of societies at large. What's happening with the common man, of course, what's happening with everyone. How do people's lives in the past matter? And in many ways, I mean, you can't separate architecture from people's lives. People have lived in dwellings for a long time. People very deliberately craft their dwellings. The choice of materials, the choice of technology, the choice of shapes that they will eventually build in emerges. Sometimes it's organic, sometimes it's a limitation of the material they use. So if you use only wood, you're not going to have rooms with spans more than 10 to 12 feet. If you're going to build with thatch, all your roofs are invariably going to be sloped. Nice. If you're going to build in load-bearing ways, your walls are going to be very thick. You're going to have very small windows. And so some of these are not choices people make, but the material and technology make for them. Sometimes the climate will determine a lot of things. Sometimes one's finances contribute. Your society's finances contribute to this. Your state finances, how prosperous you are, which means are you successful militarily. If you are successful militarily, you're campaigning in other places, looking at other things people have built and desirous of building those things back home. So, again, you really have a much bigger historical and geographical narrative and also a social one to explain what architecture is.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's nothing new moving from architecture to history. But yes, I do not design buildings for a living. I know how they are designed.
Yes. Very nice, very nice. So, was there also quite a lot of encouragement at your home? How was the ecosystem at your home? Your parents, were they okay making a choice of this kind?
Yeah, my parents have never really told me what I should be doing.
No interference.
Once, I think, when I was in the 12th, they asked me, since they never saw me studying, if I was actually interested in going to college. And they also told me that not everybody needs to go to college.
Oh my word. No, so
but,
okay.
If that's a choice you're going to make, let us know early on so we can make other provisions for you.
That's actually very thoughtful. That's very thoughtful, and it's very unconventional too, because I don't think anybody at that time would get such a lot of freedom, which also means that you were free to really pursue what you wanted to do, right?
Yeah. I think also a bunch of us then were voracious readers. I mean, and that's a habit I don't see as commonly anymore.
Yeah,
where we would read almost anything and everything. We knew all the bookstores. In fact, all the old Raddi stores used to have books that people had discarded that you could buy really cheap.
Second-hand books.
Second-hand, third-hand. Who knows how many clean or dirty hands had touched the book. But but we read and we read and we still continue to read. And I think that does make a difference.
Absolutely. In fact, reading is such a central to a lot of things. So now that you're finishing your graduation, undergraduate degree in Pune University, I suppose, in BArc, if I'm correct. So how did the transition to the US happen?
Well, I don't know if you've read a book by an architect called Gautam Bhatia. The book is Punjabi Baroque.
Oh, okay. I know Gautam Bhatia, who also writes on law.
That's a different person. Gautam Bhatia, the lawyer. Yes.
Lawyer, yeah.
And so this book is all about the both emotional and other professional troubles he had dealing with clients who insisted on particular kinds of tastes that they wanted to impose. And an architect really cannot say no to the client. He has to convince them otherwise. And so architectural practice is a tough one.
Yeah.
Unless you're willing to put aside some of your thinking and give in to what people tell you. Or unless you're powerful enough that people will just accept
whatever you are. Right.
And so I thought, since I'm interested in history, I would deal with things where there are no living clients. People who've built these buildings are long dead. So why not get into conservation?
Nice.
And so my engagement with history, engagement with history as an extension of architecture really happened with my master's degree. And that's when you start realizing that you are making decisions to sometimes restore, sometimes repair, sometimes even neglect parts of a building without understanding the greater context of its production. Why was something built a certain way? Was this common? Are you justified in saving a certain shape? Does it really matter? And then you have philosophical problems like the ship of Theseus.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're going to replace everything one piece at a time, is it really the original?
Absolutely.
What are you preserving anyway? If the only way to preserve something is to change it, what is preservation? And so, to get out of very difficult, situations that professionals have to face all the time, I thought it was best to get into another domain where not only do you have live clients, but you don't have to deal with the physicality of most things at all.
That's fascinating. But it also, I bet that this is actually kind of a retrospective thing.
I mean, I think everything
is it?
Every rationalization is only really done in retrospect.
Absolutely. Now, no kind of arguments on that, because I agree with you, because that's how
I think sometimes in a lab you come up with a theory only after things have happened.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely. In fact, the process of doing experimental physics, I talk on experimental physics because that's my domain, but it is true in a lot of other domains within the scientific research, is that this hypothesis-driven phenomena is effective only to a certain extent. Even people like Peter Mewar and others have questioned whether at all things what we do is only purely from a hypothetical viewpoint, because postulating a hypothesis would lead to something, but you may have to revise that post facto, in the sense you may have to reorient the question. In fact, this is something we also tell our students, especially in laboratory situation. Glad that you brought it up, because there are a lot of reorientations which have to happen as you progress in asking a question. And I assume that is the same even in history.
We do that a lot, where sometimes we say, I mean, it's good to have a goal and a hypothesis, but let your argument emerge from the data itself. Don't believe your hypothesis to be true. In fact, challenge it occasionally and see if the data agrees with you.
Very nice, because that is something which is very, very critical. And it also probably brings in an element of play, which is so kind of fascinating about research.
No, also if you're going to spend 3-4 years doing research, and if you think you already know the answers, how boring is it?
Exactly.
I mean, there's no greater delight than proving yourself wrong.
No. It's such a... that is a delight of actually exploration. I totally agree with you. Going further, Pushkar, tell us a little bit about the kind of work, what you did. And before that, even the transition you made from India to US. How was that transition? How was the work culture? For example, you were kind of getting into a stream which was mainly in the domain of architectural history, art history in Philadelphia. Please tell us about the transition and also what kind of work what you did.
Again, I think the first pleasant shock was the informality that students and professors had, where everybody addressed each other by first name. And you didn't have to stand up to answer a question.
Yes.
And in fact, people thought it was very strange in seminars around a round table, where every time I had to talk, I would stand up. And people would say, no, sit down.
Very interesting.
And also the kind of schooling we have in writing formal letters in Babu English, I think you forget that very quickly.
Yes.
Where there are no obedient, humble servants anymore.
Exactly.
You get to the point and these are all little cultural changes. You adjust quickly to them. Again, university settings, you have a much greater diversity in terms of the age of students, for example. I expected everybody around me to be in their early 20s like I was, but you had some 40-year-olds who had come back to university after working in industry. And so that was also very healthy and pleasant to have this kind of diversity.
Fabulous. That's actually very nice.
And also, we assume that if you're in a position of any kind of privilege in India, without questioning, you will go to school and then you will go to college and then you will get a master's degree. Whereas there was no default route in what people were doing, and which is why they very often took breaks between various things. And decided what they wanted to do, why they wanted to do it, and then came back with a purpose. So the purpose is not to pass exams. The purpose is actually to learn something you're interested in.
Nice. Is there a lesson for our...
I think I would be happy if students really after their bachelor's degrees took a year or two off just to explore the world in any which way. You might take up a job, you might travel, you might attach yourself to somebody's lab for pleasure, but don't jump into this next degree business immediately.
It's a very important thing.
In fact, it's only at that stage in life that you can very easily lose a year and nobody is going to really question you for it.
Absolutely. Now, this is a very crucial element what you're mentioning. But there is always a kind of uncertainty associated with this.
But the uncertainty doesn't go away even if you do a master's immediately.
Absolutely.
See, there is always going to be a phase of uncertainty. No matter what you do and what timeline you do it by. Everybody is going to face a certain period of job insecurity, job uncertainty. But again, that's because we've decided that all we want to do is get a job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, true.
But maybe there are other things to be done. And who knows, had I not gotten a job at the University of Pennsylvania easily, I might have been doing something completely different. Or had I not moved to ICER, had I just decided to quit that and come back to India, I might be doing something different. And there are people who do manage to pursue various kinds of interests without being at the heart of certain disciplines.
So, what kind of work did you pursue there in Philadelphia when you were at UPenn?
So as art historians, our primary premise is that any object speaks a certain truth, whereas texts that historians rely on are capable of lying a lot more. And so, example, if you have a text that says the king built a palace with 400 rooms, and you do an archaeological excavation, and you see that the palace only has 80 rooms, it is very obvious that the text is not telling the truth. So in a court of law, the archaeological evidence will win over the textual evidence. So an art historian or an architectural historian or an archaeologist, anybody who deals or interprets the material is always going to be in a position better than the textual. Having said that, when a text says that a king built a palace with 400 rooms, there is reason for doing that. Why 400? What does it mean? Is it a literary trope? Is it some kind of metaphysical privileging? So every time you say, this was a city with 52 gates, it's because there are 52 weeks in a year. And so certain numbers have certain privileges. We love to put everything in fields of 7. You say the rainbow has 7 colors. Actually, the rainbow can have any number of colors that you want. Or you say the 7 seas, the 7 continents, because we've decided to privilege the number 7. There is a metaphysical privilege. The metaphysics comes from a philosophical system. And so this bigger cultural context becomes very important to understand the text. Archaeology doesn't always require that context. In fact, sometimes you even define the context. But in any case, our method was to look at our primary evidence is the material and textual evidence is the supporting evidence. Whereas if you go with a historian, the text is the primary evidence and everything else is supplementary. We also took courses in anthropology, in a lot of other disciplines. And what we realized is that disciplines are defined by method. The method you use defines what discipline you are in. And so anthropologists have this classic method called the ethnographic method, where you observe people, you observe societies. It comes with its own problems, it comes with its own biases, but you have these kinds of methods which have also been self-critiqued. All these disciplines have had enormous self-critiques.
Yes.
Whether it's history, whether it's anthropology, whether it's art history, whether it's archaeology, every discipline has looked upon itself and tried to parse it apart. The sciences have never had a self-critique. You've always had people from outside the sciences who had a critique of science. Whether it be Bruno Latour, whether it is Thomas Kuhn, who was a physicist, but his critique was not in his role as a physicist. It was as a historian of science or a philosopher of science.
Correct. You're right. In fact, his whole tenet of the structural revolution brings a historical viewpoint to the way sciences have been done, and the paradigm shift viewpoint, what he brought in was, of course, very interesting. Although it has now been also challenged in certain kind of contexts, because there are so many things which also happen organically in many, many different ways.
No, so it's one thing to have a faith in the method that your discipline follows, but it's also very important to have a critique of it.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely. In fact, that is one thing which is where there's a lot of debate nowadays. In fact, part of the reason why I'm doing this kind of conversations with people both inside and sometimes even slightly outside the conventional framework is to address these questions of how to look at science, because one of the criticisms of science globally and particularly from an Indian viewpoint is that insularity, that we have not been able to actually interface with the society as much as which is necessary. There was a phase of time, probably it was needed for them to just shut themselves in the laboratory to do something. But you can see that the consequence of that has not been very good.
No, but even the outreach from science has been the attitude of a preacher, where you tell everybody that you know the truth and this is what the truth is. Whereas there needs to be an engagement by which the challenges are also accepted.
That fluidity, I should admit it is not still there. Because see, I would not even call it as a superiority complex, but the fact that there are kind of axioms which you start with, because the moment you start kind of making the rules of the game a little fluid, there are other kind of consequences of that.
No. See, you can't make holes because you'll be flooded in no time.
Yeah, exactly.
But at the same time, there are controlled ways in which you let in certain leaks.
Absolutely.
And then counter them.
Absolutely. Now, this is something which is important. You know, this is the fundamental reason why I am talking to people like Pushkar. In fact, this is so critical for us as scientists and also people who are interested in science to not, lock themselves up either in the laboratory or in the laboratory of the mind only. There is necessity of that small holes which are necessary for you to bring in new things inside. In that way, history has actually has a slightly kind of a kind of different problem, right? Because there it is so big, open.
No, so again, there is no unlike you have in the professions where if you're a doctor, you have to be with the Indian Medical Association, or as an engineer, you're licensed as an engineer. As a scientist, you're accredited as a scientist. In the case of history, anybody who's done a BA from anywhere, or not done a BA, just well-read, can call himself or herself a historian. And again, that is no problem, but a lot of these people do not engage with primary sources.
Exactly.
What they are doing is they're really looking at secondary, tertiary sources where it's very easy to misinterpret everything. So you're really having commentaries on commentaries.
Yes.
And so it's like a scientist who does not rely on any kind of experimental verification.
It's a great analogy. What you're giving here is this is something which I have also kind of touched upon in the past solo episodes, some of the ones I have done. This, kind of jugalbandi of sources, where primary sources still actually hold a very important kind of position. Of course, to approach any primary sources, you might actually make use of the secondary sources as a clutch and then scale up and try to actually look at this. This is
but which is where this whole idea of science as a pyramid where the bottom is built and then you keep building on top of it. You have to visit the foundations periodically.
Absolutely correct. In fact, this is a question of very high relevance also in kind of making a kind of fine discrimination between science and technology. Because technology interfaces with society and therefore there is a lot of interest in general public. But if you look at the other face of the technology, it has very deep connections with sciences. And this is also not a one-way street. If you see the structure of industrial revolution.
No, in fact, a lot of scientific discovery is propelled or powered by needs of technology.
Absolutely correct. In fact, second law of thermodynamics, if you look at its origin, actually is in some of the thought processes of Carnot trying to understand efficiency of engines. So that is actually one of the most fundamental laws in physical sciences, which has origins in a application, or for that matter, even black body radiation.
Or understanding pressure really comes out of trying to raise water out of mines. You can't raise more than 30 feet at a time.
Precisely right. So this kind of viewpoint is very, very critical. And this primary source aspect, what you're mentioning, is so important. Because that is one place where the interest in history has been kind of propelled thanks to various different sources, but it also has been sometimes diluted because the fact that the primary sources have not been consulted. How has a historian, see, in your case, as an archaeological historian or an architectural historian, you actually can go into the site or into that particular artifact.
No, but see, with a number of archaeological excavations, once the excavations are done, you might have finds in some repository, but what really needs to be produced is an honest report, which is as close to a primary source as you can get. Everything is drawn there, everything is provided, there are descriptions, and it should be transparent enough that even if something is misinterpreted, you can spot the misinterpretation.
Very nice.
And so, again, it's like, a paper that is published based on experimentation really needs to be transparent enough that, 50 years later, if you realize there is a flaw in the experiment, it's obvious in the paper itself.
Very nicely put. Because no matter how good is the primary source, its interpretation and its kind of presentation also plays a critical role, as you mentioned correctly. So, when you look at this kind of way of looking at knowledge, and which you have been involved, which is one of the things I would want to also touch upon, is the fantastic books you have written and also co-written with your other co-authors. And recently, you also have a book out in 2023, The Taming the Oriental Bazaar, which I had a look at it. It's fascinating, where you look at the architecture of market halls in the colonial period and other things. And previous to that, you have written about architecture of Deccan Sultanate. Jewish heritage is something which you have also, explored and understood and written about. And one of the very, prominent literatures which has come out of your hands and mind is the Aurangabad and Daulatabad, Ahmednagar, and the architecture related to this. So these are some of the books, and of course you have edited books and also various different journal articles. I would want you to give us a kind of a kind of viewpoint of how you go about putting these things together. What is your process? And from ideas to the literature, take us through that journey.
So, to begin with, different books are written for different audiences and different agencies. So, if you look at two of those books, the one on Aurangabad and the one on the Jewish heritage of the Deccan, both of these are meant to be accurate scholarly books, but for lay audiences. So that when you buy the book, which is priced at under 500 rupees, you can actually travel with it and look at places. And so the language is accessible. It's not making any claims that are new. This is all knowledge that is already in the
literature,
in the domain of historic knowledge. It's basically synthesizing it for these particular sites. So that you can travel with it. The book on the Deccan Sultanates or the book on the colonial market halls are scholarly books in that they deal with a lot of primary architectural evidence. There is a lot of original thinking, and again, like good scholarly books, they are extensively footnoted. You'll find all kinds of references. And then the edited books really operate around themes where I myself might be inadequate to talk about a big theme. And you get 4 or 5 people who can contribute in various ways. And your job is to basically read what they've written, try and understand it, and build a big narrative in which it can all be fit. So it's like inviting ingredients from everybody and then giving a name to the dish that you eventually make. And so all these books have very different processes where when you know exactly what audience you're writing for, you write differently. The books that are research-based, of course, when you look at primary data and primary evidence for a long time, you have a burning desire to tell the world about it. And that's when you really write a book. So sometimes you might have written 7-8 articles about various aspects. And you say all this really makes sense if it's all put together in a single volume.
Nice.
But just like I always tell PhD students who are applying, unless you have a burning question for which you need answers, don't bother doing a PhD.
Yes, yeah, true.
And that question might change, and that question might morph. It might completely be replaced by a different question. But I need to see this, where you're so curious about something that you're willing to read any amount, you're willing to write any amount, you're willing to do anything to have it answered.
Nice.
And similarly, before you write a book, you have to be burning to tell people. You have to have this desire to tell people a story about things nobody knows about.
Very nice, very nice. That actually makes a lot of sense, because that is the kind of momentum you require to get slightly bigger projects like books to get going, right? Because otherwise, if you keep second guessing your intentions, then you would never be able to do that at all.
So if you're writing a textbook, make it a textbook.
Yeah, exactly. So this whole process of going to the sources, in your case, you have to go to the sites and also.
But also, there is no substitute to really reading everything that's been written in the past.
Absolutely right.
And it just takes longer and longer. The more things have been written about it.
So, do you have a very structured reading program for yourself?
No, there are weeks when all I do is read. There are weeks when I don't touch a book. I think I'm very erratic in all my habits. So there might be a period of 1 or 2 months when all I'm doing is writing, and then I might not be able to write for months on end.
No, but having served on committees, I know also that you write quickly because I have had the privilege of actually, being in some of the committees where we were part of it, and I could see that you could articulate your thoughts quite quickly and other things. That is one very good thing about social sciences, which I see as slightly different in natural sciences. The natural sciences, of course, you would give a lot of time and effort to interpretation. And many a time students generally have an issue with the presentation of the work. Do you see that similar point?
I think, let's face it, 50-60% of students, for whatever reason, are incapable of writing, reading, or speaking. And it's not something that's going to be better in the sciences or worse in the social sciences or vice versa. It's just across the board.
Why do you think so, Pushkar?
Because
very unfortunate, right?
Because the whole emphasis in schooling has been on reading is limited to textbooks.
Yes, you are right. Absolutely correct.
Writing is limited to exams. And speaking is discouraged, period.
Fantastically put. You have actually summed up the whole problem very, very succinctly.
And so, I'll show you students at ICER. There'll be the 20% who can read, write, and speak very well. And you go to any program in the social sciences or humanities, and again, it's going to be 20% who can read, write, and speak well.
I'm surprised. I thought that number is generally slightly on a higher side in social sciences, no?
Not necessarily.
See, how much has it to do with the language? Because...
but let me see articulation in some language.
Yes, exact.
Let me see reading in some language. If you read very well in Gujarati or Kannada or Bengali, I have no problem. But show me that you've been reading.
Very, very, very nicely put. See, this element of exposure also comes at a cost, at least in this particular situation, where the time you have to dedicate to these kind of endeavors would be taking you away from something they are supposed to do, right? That is a trade-off. A lot of students will be willing to do that, right?
I think more than the students, it's the parents.
Precisely right. This is so important point. What you're mentioning is it again goes back to the origin, right? Because how you grow up in a house where you're encouraged to read widely, ask questions, talk, be articulate, articulation not only in terms of speech but also in writing and other things. It's very
no. I still struggle with writing. I'm not a great writer. Writing is it's very difficult to believe that somebody wrote and then just wrote in a single draft. You have to revise it time and again. Writing is painful, but it has to be done. Like a lot of things we do daily.
Exactly.
There are unpleasant tasks and there are pleasant tasks.
Absolutely. Do you write on a computer, or do you prefer old technology, like pen and paper?
Both.
That's very nice. So, Pushkar, also give us a viewpoint of kind of projects you have been looking at currently, you and your research group. What kind of questions you are interested in, and what are the things you are trying to do?
So currently I'm with some colleagues from Deccan College. We are looking at temples that get built between, let's say, about 1300 and 1600. Because there is a narrative in the northern Deccan that no temples get built in this period. When actually what we realize is that a lot of temples do get built in this period. And there is a political narrative which prevents this kind of imagination.
Yeah.
But the both architectural and archaeological evidence is overwhelmingly otherwise. What happens is that the role of temples changes. And they start becoming of a very different nature. But so this survey of temples is very important. There's a big inscription in Tanjavur which I've been translating for a while, and that I really hope to finish the book manuscript soon. It's been one of those projects where I started it over a decade ago, and every time something else came up, that was put aside. And so I think finishing that now is very important. It's an interesting inscription because in printed form it's over 100 pages long. And, it's also made in a day and age when nobody's really making these inscriptions in 1804. And so there is a whole story as to why it's done in Devanagari where nobody reads it, why it's in Marathi which nobody understands over there, why it's inscribed in a way that nobody can ever be able to read it, but yet it's done in the temple of Tanjavur.
So the Maratha influence was quite...
the Marathas are ruling. It's done by Sarfoji II. And it's all done in order to make a claim to Colin Mackenzie, who's collecting histories of the region. So he has this history composed and gives the written form to Colin Mackenzie. And what better way to prove that it's authentic than say, look, it's even inscribed.
Wow. So they are actually now trying to do in architecture what as a kind of
So and again, I mean, the choice of language, script, why that particular site, everything has a different story.
So this is the main Tanjavur temple?
Yeah, the Brihadeshwara temple.
Wow, fascinating. So you do visit there often? And
I've been there a few times. There are transcriptions available. Those are also problematic, but workable. And there are always lots of small projects because every time you're looking to procrastinate, you start off thinking about something different and never follow up. So I have a folder called Unfinished Works where you've started off, done something for a week and then pushed it aside.
Nice. So generally, what is your kind of inclination? You start with problems which are kind of extracted from literature, or you have certain kind of interest and you then go deep into that, or what is the kind of...
Again, I don't think there is a set pattern or paradigm. Sometimes something just emerges from what you've been seeing or what you've been reading. And, for example, this book on colonial market halls. So everybody knows, in Bangalore you have Russell Market and the other one, what used to be called City Market. You had Moore Market in Madras. In Calcutta you have New Market or Hog Market later. Bombay, Crawford, Pune, Mandai. In Baroda you have Khanderao market, in Gwalior you have Victoria market, in Tumkur you have a market.
Yes.
I mean, in Fulton, small towns, big towns, princely states, presidency cities, everybody has market halls of this kind.
Yeah.
And these are all buildings which are supposed to be looked at from the outside, as much as they are functional. But they are monumental, all of them.
Nice.
And they start sometime in the 1870s and end sometime in the 1930s.
That's very interesting.
And so why is it that they are built only in this short period of time? And so it's this kind of thing. As you're traveling, you notice this and you say, what's happening? So you start reading. Then you realize that the problem starts with 1857, where after the mutiny of soldiers, you have to balance Indian soldiers with regiments of European soldiers to check them. And so British soldiers are rotated all the time.
Oh, okay.
So you'll have a regiment brought for 5 years, they're sent back. Another regiment comes, 5 years, sent back. And only about 2/3 of them go back because a third of them die.
Yes.
Tropical disease. And remember, there's no germ theory at this time.
Yeah.
And so they set up various sanitation commissions and so on. And this Leith Commission basically recommends hygienic conditions, which in those days means what we would still think of as commonsensical: more ventilation, more flowing water, and so on. And they decide to control the places in which things are sold for consumption. So market halls come about, and these are really for Europeans initially. And so in sanitary conditions, you will sell produce, meat, and everything. And they still believe in miasma theories, so there are bad airs and everything. And when all this is happening, the railways are also emerging in India. And what you have for railway construction, these big steel trusses for building stations, it's the perfect thing for market halls too. And so the architecture of market halls is the same as the train stations.
Nice.
And then eventually you will have the germ theory. You also have the opening of the Suez Canal in between, which means you start having Englishmen who come on short service commissions, 5 years, 10 years. So earlier, if an Englishman came, chances were he never went back, or they lived here for generations.
Yeah.
The children would be sent back to boarding school, and then they would also come back. Now you have people who have only a 5-10 year engagement, and so they want to live in India like Europeans live, like English live in England. And so these market halls get a new boost.
Nice.
And then once the British presidency cities will do it, the princely states will immediately follow. Once the big princely states do it, the small princely states will do it, and so on. And so this becomes a place where not only do you display a certain kind of modern institution, a certain kind of progressiveness, you also show benevolence as a ruler, and you also build a landmark that proclaims your city. You're also in step with modern hygienic practices, medical theories. And so, everything comes together. And of course, the railways are... So all these markets are usually very close to train stations.
Oh, yeah, very nice. Yes, you're right. At least going by, at least in...
usually.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely right. That's a very fascinating thing. So, these kind of explorations would require you to travel a lot?
I think apart from reading, traveling with an open mind is what everybody should do. Just don't look into your phone, look around.
Yeah, true. That's actually fabulous advice for anybody. So, Pushkar, we're going to actually lighten up the conversation a little bit. First, I request you to speak a few words and sentences in your mother tongue, and talk to us about what kind of work you do and why you do.
मी स्थापत्याचा अभ्यास करतो, ऐतिहासिक स्थापत्याचा, आणि मला मराठीत बोलणं शक्य आहे कारण आत्ताच गेल्या काही वर्षात अजून 3 वास्तुकारांबरोबर मी एक 2 खंडात एक महाराष्ट्रातल्या वास्तुकलेवर पुस्तकं संपादित केलेली आहेत. ती बहुधा ह्या वर्षी किंवा पुढच्या वर्षी उपलब्ध होतील. याच्यात महाराष्ट्र राज्यात 2500 वर्षापूर्वीपासून सन 2000 पर्यंत जी वास्तुकला आणि स्थापत्य निर्माण झालं यांच्याबद्दल माहिती आहे.
Fabulous. Could you just translate us a little? I could understand.
Yeah.
Having now been that way, but for other.
In the past few years, along with 3 other colleagues, for the Maharashtra Rajya Sahitya Samskriti Mandal, we have been editing and writing a big 2-volume work, both in English and in Marathi, separate editions, on architecture of Maharashtra.
Wow, fantastic.
From early historic times right up to the year 2000. So it includes contemporary architecture and so on. And so...
when is that supposed to be out?
It should have been last year, but the press, it's a government press, so between changes in government, then changes in machinery, then people had to be trained on the new machinery, then they had some issues with the state electricity board. So I think all that has been resolved, and they were supposed to give us dummy copies just about any time now.
Oh wow. So I would surely look forward to that. And this will be available online too, or it will be only...
No, it should be in hard copy. I'll let you know when it comes.
Yeah, great.
Being a government publication, it's also massively subsidized, I think.
Okay, great. So listeners who are actually hearing this, if you are fascinated by that beautiful architecture across Maharashtra...
The only thing I can't guarantee is the timeline for the publication of these books. We've been waiting.
Okay. We'll look forward to it. We'll definitely look forward to that part of it. So we are almost towards the end of the conversation. Tell us or give us some recommendations, Pushkar, of various different forms of consumptions in terms of art, books, and maybe even videos, movies, etc. What you take in. It need not be just only related to your research, but anything a little broader.
I really do read almost anything that crosses my path. Again, a lot of times one is forced into watching anything that flashes in front of you. We are such gluttons for moving images that any kind of screen I'll stop and start watching. Nowadays they don't have these video coach buses, because once upon a time that's where I saw all the movies I would never pay to go and see. Nowadays I think planes do that for me. I watch movies that I would never see. But having said that, I mean, I used to watch important directors, let's say like Stanley Kubrick, but then watch all the movies in a couple of weeks. 1 or 2 movies every day.
That's education, actually. That's not just watching movies, right? Yeah.
So, but that kind of thing I really haven't been doing recently. Music... there are genres of music that I absolutely dislike, but I do like classical music, Hindustani. I also do like a lot of old hard rock and again what might have been called metal in the 90s. But I think after 2000 there isn't much that appeals to me.
Things have become alloys more than metals. In terms of the any specific kind of genre you like in music other than these two? Western?
I mean, I do listen to Western classical music, but again, I mean, I can appreciate it only at a very amateur level.
Same here.
I mean, it sounds pleasant. I don't mind having it in the background, but that's about it.
That's right.
But there is a lot of music that just doesn't sound pleasant, and I don't want it in the background.
That's true. Do you play music when you're writing or reading or something?
Actually, if you're so engrossed, it doesn't matter.
Matter at all. Okay.
Sometimes you start by playing it, but then you just don't notice it.
At all. Yeah.
Or even if it gets noisy, you don't notice it. So.
So that's very, very interesting. And any specific projects you're looking forward to now going forward? Of course, you have these projects which you're working on. Anything specific?
I'm sure I can make claims, but who knows what will happen in 6 months.
But anything specific you are very excited about to?
No, I think just finishing all these half done and started projects is important.
Yeah. I wish you all the best for
Thank
your
you.
wonderful kind of research. Also, enthusing a lot of us, because anytime we have had conversations, I have always learned very interesting and new things, and I will continue to do the same. And I'm sure our listeners would also get a lot of things out from this particular conversation. Thank you, Pushkar. Thank you for your time. Thank you. So this is Pratidhwani, where we try to humanize science, this time with the one and the only Pushkar Sohoni.